Through this upcoming video series, I wanted to narrate for you a couple of examples that Neville Goddard gave of students of his that can prove very inspiring and valuable for anyone that still doubts whether their imagination can really create a wonderful future for themselves. Because when we at first study these claims, they might seem a bit overwhelming, a bit bizarre, if we aren't used to really considering the power of our imagination to begin with. So through this video, I hope to give you some more insights and inspiration that will help you on your road to fulfilling your greatest dreams in life. The stories were taken from the book The Law and the Promise. I won't be narrating anything other than the examples that he gave in this book specifically, so that we stick to the purpose of these videos. Now with that being said, let's get into the first example Neville Goddard wrote in his book. This is a story about which some may say it would have happened anyway, but those who read it carefully will find room to wonder. It begins 1 year ago as I left Los Angeles to visit my daughter in San Francisco. Instead of the happy-natured individual she had always been, I found her in deep distress. Not knowing the cause of her anguish and not wishing to ask, I waited until she told me that she was in great financial trouble and must have $3,000 immediately. I'm not a poor woman, but I didn't have much cash I could put my hands on that quickly. Knowing my daughter, I knew she would not have accepted it anyway. I offered to borrow the money for her, but she refused and instead asked me to help her in my way. She meant using my imagination, for I had often told her of your teaching, and some of my words must have struck home. I immediately agreed on this plan with the provision that she would help me help her. We decided on an imaginal scene we could both practice that involved seeing money coming to her from everywhere. We felt money was flooding toward her from every corner until she was in the middle of a sea of money. But we did this always with the feeling of joy for anyone concerned, and we had no thought of means, only happiness for all. The idea seemed to catch fire with her, and I know she was responsible for what happened a few days later. She was certainly transformed back to the happy, confident mood that was natural to her, though there was no evidence of any real money coming in at the time. I left to return home in the East. When I arrived home, I called my mother, a lovely young lady of 91, who immediately asked me to come and see her. I wanted a day's rest, but she couldn't wait. It had to be now. Of course I went, and after greeting me, she handed me a check for $3,000 made out to my daughter. Before I could speak, she handed me 3 additional checks totaling $1,500, made in favor of my daughter's children. Her reason? She explained that she had suddenly decided the day before to give what she had in cash to those she loved while she was still here, to know of their happiness in receiving it. It would have happened anyway? No, not like this. Not within days of my daughter's frantic need, and then her sudden transformation to a mood of joy. I know that her imaginal act caused this wonderful change, bringing not only great joy to the receiver, but to the giver as well. P.S. I almost forgot to add that among the checks so lavishly given was one for me too, for $3,000. I always like those stories, and there are a couple more that deal with financial situations, because after all, finances are very important in this life. But if we can grasp the power of imagination, we can make some great stuff happen for ourselves as well. That's the point of sharing these stories with you, to set aside your disbelief and learn to trust in yourself and the power of your own mind. So this was the first example. Example number 2. Seated in my living room in San Francisco, I imagined I was in my daughter's living room in London, England. I surrounded myself so completely with that room, which I knew intimately, that I suddenly found myself actually standing in it. My daughter was standing by her fireplace, her face turned away from me. A moment later she turned and our eyes met. I saw such a startled, frightened expression on her face that I too became emotionally upset and immediately found myself back in my own living room in San Francisco. 5 days later I received an airmail letter from my daughter, which had been written on the day of my experiment with imaginal travel. In her letter she told me she had seen me in her living room that day, just as real as though I were actually standing there in the flesh. She confessed she had been frightened, and that before she could speak I had vanished. The time of this visitation, as she gave it in her letter, was exactly the time I had begun my imaginative action, allowing, of course, for the difference in time between the 2 points. She explained that she told her husband of this amazing experience, and he insisted that she write to me immediately, as he stated, "Your mother must have died or is dying." But I wasn't dead or dying, but very much alive and very excited by this marvelous experience. Now that was example number 2. This is again another indication of what we also could call bilocation. Now I personally don't have any experience with this as of yet, but I have heard many stories from other people who claim they have done this. It is absolutely fascinating because it shows that consciousness can operate independent of your own physical body, and that is one powerful thing to grasp, to know that your consciousness can do that. So no matter what your dreams are, it's the same for those dreams. You can allow them to operate with and through you independent of your current limitations and reality, and therefore it alters the world that you're living in. It's a great example of the power of the mind again. Example number 3. Soon after our marriage, my husband and I decided that our greatest joint desire was a year in Europe. This objective may seem reasonable to a lot of people, but to us, tied to a narrow sphere of limited finances, it seemed not only unreasonable, but completely ridiculous. Europe might as well have been another planet. But I had heard your teaching, so I persisted in falling asleep in England. Why England necessarily? I cannot tell, except that I had seen a current motion picture featuring the area around Buckingham Palace, and I had promptly fallen in love with that scene. All I did in my imagination was to stand quietly outside the great iron gates and feel the cold metal bars gripped tightly in my hands as I viewed the palace. For many nights I felt an intense joy at being there and fell asleep in this happy state. Soon after, my husband met a stranger at a party who, within 1 month, was instrumental in securing a teaching fellowship for him at a great university. Imagine my excitement when I heard the university was in England. Tied to a narrow sphere, within another month we were crossing the Atlantic, and our supposedly insurmountable difficulties melted as though they never existed. We had our year in Europe, one of the happiest years of my life. Traveling through the power of your imagination, it's quite something. Again, what we're doing here, and what this person did, and what you can do, is place yourself inwardly where you want to be physically. In the case of traveling, I mean, currently I'm involved with someone that is from America, yet I am in Europe, and this one thing that I suggest to do is constantly to imagine being in Europe with me. Now she's doing that, and we already have plans of making it happen, even though there might be limited finances at first when we made the decision to do so. But the way will always be created. We're proving this in our private lives currently, and you can do the same. Just again, set aside your disbelief. Trust in the process, trust in the power of imagination. Example number 4. My home is old, but it is mine. I wanted the exterior painted and the interior redecorated, yet I had no money to accomplish either objective. You told us to live as though our desire is already a reality, and this I began to do, imagining my house with a brand new coat of paint, new furnishings, new decoration, and all the trimmings. I walked in my imagination through the newly decorated rooms. I walked around the outside admiring the fresh paint, and at the end of my imaginal act, I handed the contractor a check for payment in full. I entered this imaginal scene faithfully, as often as I could during the day and each night before I fell asleep. Within 2 weeks I received a registered letter from Lloyd's of London, telling me I had inherited $7,000 from a woman I had never met. I had known her brother slightly almost 40 years before, and had performed a small service 15 years ago for the lady when this brother had died in her country, and she had written to me asking for particulars regarding his death, which I was able to provide. I had not heard from her since that time. Now here was the check for $7,000, more than enough to cover the cost of my house restoration, plus many other things I desired. Very interesting story again. Again, these people are placing themselves inwardly on the mental realm in the state of their fulfilled desires, and that's always how the ways for its manifestation are set in motion. Again, that's what I try to teach people through my own lectures on this channel, but Neville did a beautiful job collecting these stories from other people as well, so that we hopefully can start believing in ourselves again. Example number 5. Ever since I entered into the art field, I have enjoyed doing sketches and paintings for children's rooms. However, I've been discouraged by advisors and friends who were far more experienced in the field than I. They liked my work, admired my talent, but said I would not get recognition or pay for this type of work. Somehow I always felt I would, but how? Then last fall I heard your lectures and read your books, and I decided to let my imagination create the reality I desired. This is what I did daily. I imagined I was in a gallery. There was a great deal of excitement about me. On the walls hung my art, only mine, a one-woman show, and I saw red stars on many of the pictures. This would indicate that they had been sold. This is what happened. Just before Christmas, I did a mobile for a friend who showed it in turn to a friend of hers, who owns an art import shop in Pasadena. He expressed the desire to meet me, so I took a few samples of my work along. When he looked at the very first painting, he said he would like to give me a one-woman show in the spring. The night of the opening, April 17th, an interior decorator came and liked and commissioned me to do a collage for a little boy's room, which will appear in the September issue of Good Housekeeping for the 1961 House of the Year. Later during the showing, another decorator came and admired my work so much he asked if he might arrange for me to meet the right interior decorators and the right owners of galleries who would buy and display my work properly. Incidentally, the show was a financial success for the owner of the gallery as well as for me. The interesting thing about this is that seemingly these 3 men came to me out of the blue. Certainly I made no effort during the time of my imagining to contact anyone. But now I'm getting recognition and have a market for my work. And now I know without a shadow of a doubt that there is no when you seriously apply the principle that imagination creates reality. I really love that one because it deals with art. You know, in my own life I'm pretty creative with my own goals and projects, but it is something that I had to learn myself. To learn to imagine myself being successful at what I do and just keep that state alive within my consciousness. And then it keeps me compelling to do things, and it keeps attracting people that are interested in what I do as well. It's exactly how it happened for this woman, and it can happen for you as well, no matter what your dreams or desires are. Alright, the 6th example, and it's also the final one for this video. It said, I run a small business, solely owned, and a few years ago it seemed that my venture would end in failure. For some months, sales had fallen steadily, and I found myself in a financial jam, along with thousands of other small businessmen, as the spirit spanned one of our country's minor recessions. I was badly in debt, and I needed at least $3,000 almost immediately. My auditors advised me to close my doors and try to salvage what I could. Instead, I turned to my imagination. I knew your teaching, but had never actually attempted to solve any problem in this manner. I was frankly skeptical of the entire idea that imagination can create reality, but I was also desperate, and desperation forced me to test your teaching. I imagined my office receiving $4,000 unexpectedly. This money would have to come from new orders, as my accounts receivable were practically non-existent. But this seemed far-fetched, as I hadn't received this much in sales during the last 4 months or more. Nevertheless, I kept my imaginal picture of receiving this amount of money steadily before me for 3 days. Early the 4th morning, a customer I had not heard of from in months called me on the telephone, asking me to come and see him personally. I was to bring a quotation previously given him for machinery needed by his factory. The quotation was months old, but I dug it out of my files and lost no time in arriving at his office that day. I wrote out the order which he signed, but I saw no immediate help for me in the transaction, as the equipment he wanted would take from 4 to 6 months for factory delivery. And of course, my customer did not have to pay for it until I delivered. I thanked him for the order and rose to leave. He stopped me at the door and handed me a check for a little over $4,000, saying, "I want to pay for the merchandise now in advance, for tax purposes, you know. You don't mind?" No, I didn't mind. I realized what had happened the moment I took that check into my hands. Within 3 days, my imaginal act had done for me what I hadn't been able to do in months of desperate financial shoveling. I know now that imagination could have brought $40,000 into my business just as easily as $4,000. Isn't that a fascinating example? Again, most people might shrug this all off as coincidence, as a luck, or whatever you want to call it. But what we want to understand is that the mind, our consciousness, is a power that can attract whatever we need and want into our physical worlds. That's exactly what happened to these people. By having the idea in their imagination and also by being emotionally involved in it, that sets up the attractive force, the law of attraction in the universe, to bring to you the resources, people and things you need in order to manifest your own imaginary states. With all these examples, well, there were only 6 of them, but we'll do more videos of these, specifically about examples that he gave. You gotta learn to believe in yourself. You gotta believe in yourself and in your dreams. Then you can make such wonderful things happen. Because we should never forget, dear viewer, that we are the dreamers.